The Galactic Council hall was silent as the last human diplomat stood in the center of the chamber, his face cast in flickering shadows from the torches surrounding him. He was bound to a thick, metallic stake, his uniform in tatters, and his once pristine diplomatic insignia stained with blood. The collective of alien species, a grand assembly of over 200 interstellar civilizations, watched in cold indifference as the verdict was read aloud by the Council's High Arbiter. Humanity stands accused of defiance, arrogance, and violation of intergalactic order, the Arbiter declared in a rasping, guttural voice. The punishment is death by incineration. The human, Ambassador Elias Kane, looked up with a broken smile, his lips cracked and bruised. He had suffered beatings, interrogations, and deprivation at the hands of his captors, yet there was not an ounce of fear in his eyes. He exhaled, glancing at the holographic cameras broadcasting his execution across the galaxy. His last words would be heard. "You think this will end it?" he rasped, his voice weak but unwavering. "You have no idea what you've just done." The Arbiter signaled, and the executioners activated the plasma flames. As the inferno roared to life, the last thing Ambassador Kane did was smile. On a remote planet in the Sol system, thousands of light-years away, the feed of Elias Kane's execution was broadcasted across every human world, station, and colony. The reaction was immediate. Shockwaves of horror and disbelief rippled through humanity's core worlds. The unified Earth government declared an emergency session. The Martian Directorate mobilized its fleets. The Outer Colonies, often at odds with the inner worlds, set aside their grievances and pledged their warships, their soldiers, and their resources to a singular purpose: vengeance. Within hours, Earth's highest military authority, Supreme Admiral Grant Vasquez, appeared before the War Council. His face was lined with age and experience, his dark eyes reflecting the cold steel of a man who had seen more battles than he cared to count. He stood before the gathered leaders of humanity, the video of Kane's execution playing on a loop behind him. He did not waste time with speeches. He did not call for unity. He simply said, "We burn them." The Galactic Council, seated in its pristine, towering station above the capital world of Orvan Prime, remained unaware of what they had truly set in motion. They had crushed countless civilizations before, wiping out rebellious upstarts without consequence. They had executed leaders, enslaved populations, and erased cultures, all in the name of maintaining order. They had assumed humanity would be no different. They were wrong. As the first human warships entered the Orvan system, the Council dismissed it as a mere act of defiance, a futile attempt at revenge by an inferior species. Their fleets, vast and technologically superior, had crushed entire empires before. They believed they would do so again. Then the bombardments began. The first strike was precise, a surgical extermination of the Council's planetary defense arrays. Human stealth frigates infiltrated the system under the cover of jamming fields, obliterating key installations with kinetic rods from orbit. By the time the Council realized what was happening, Earth's battle fleets had already surrounded Orvan Prime. Supreme Admiral Vasquez stood aboard the bridge of the UEG dreadnought Retribution, gazing at the panicked messages flooding the Council's communications. The alien voices, once arrogant and condescending, now trembled with desperation. "Human fleet, you are in violation of..." Vasquez cut the channel. "Commence orbital bombardment," he ordered. The sky above Orvan Prime burned. The Council's defenses were not just overwhelmed, they were annihilated. Humanity's war machine moved with a precision and ruthlessness unseen in galactic history. Entire fleets of the so-called superior races were reduced to floating wreckage. The humans, outnumbered but not outmatched, fought with a fury and strategic brilliance that defied all logic. The Council's once proud armadas were not merely defeated. They were exterminated. World after world fell. Those who had stood by and watched Kane's execution, who had laughed at humanity's pain, found themselves on the receiving end of a force that did not negotiate, did not take prisoners, and did not offer mercy. It was not war. It was eradication. The Council's ruling body, the same one that had sentenced Kane to death, barricaded themselves within the Grand Assembly Hall. They sent pleas for peace. They begged. They swore that humanity had made its point. But it was too late. Supreme Admiral Vasquez stood before a holographic display of Orvan Prime's capital city, now reduced to rubble and flame. The council leaders huddled in the ruins of their once mighty empire, waiting for an answer. Vasquez gave them one. Fire. Orvan Prime burned. The Galactic Council, the so-called enforcers of peace and order, ceased to exist. Humanity did not just win. They made an example. And across the stars, the message was clear. Humanity was not to be trifled with. The ruins of Orvan Prime still smoldered, its once glistening towers reduced to charred husks, its streets littered with the twisted remains of what was once the seat of galactic power. The fires of human retribution had turned the so-called Galactic Council's proudest world into an open grave. Yet, humanity did not stop. They could not stop. This was not just war. This was an annihilation campaign, a reckoning for every arrogant decree, every planetary enslavement, every genocidal ruling the Council had inflicted upon the countless civilizations beneath them. Humanity had merely been the latest target, the latest species to suffer under the weight of their arrogance. Now, they were the last. The message spread like wildfire across the stars. Human fleets moved like ghosts through Council space, their warships striking without warning, without hesitation, without mercy. The species who had once laughed at humanity's weakness now screamed in terror, begging for surrender, for negotiations. Humanity did not respond. They burned everything. On the bridge of the Retribution, Supreme Admiral Vasquez stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the holo-display of ongoing operations. The fleet's advance was ahead of schedule, with dozens of systems already in human control. His officers, seasoned veterans of a dozen conflicts, moved with silent efficiency, their faces grim but resolute. The war was going better than expected. Too well. Vasquez frowned. "Admiral," said his second-in-command, Commander Julia Kova, "we've received new intelligence. Some of the remaining Council species have gathered in a desperate attempt to regroup. They're calling it the Last Bastion." Vasquez didn't react at first, merely turning his gaze to the holographic display. A series of Council-controlled systems had been marked, and in the heart of them, a single fortified world glowed red. It was known as Clyson VA, a fortress world so heavily defended it had never fallen to any known enemy. Vasquez exhaled slowly. "They're cornered." "Yes, sir." Kova nodded. "They know they can't win, but they think they can hold out. If we take Clyson VA, the war is over." Vasquez nodded. "Then we take it." Clyson VA was not just a fortress, it was a declaration. The Council's surviving fleets had gathered here, rallying under one final, desperate banner. The war-weary admirals of over 24 species assembled their remaining warships, pooling together everything they had left. If humanity wanted to finish the job, they would have to fight through the largest, most fortified stronghold the galaxy had ever seen. And humanity welcomed the challenge. The fleets arrived in waves, Earth's battleships leading the charge, flanked by Martian destroyers and Outer Colony carriers. Against them, the Council's last remaining dreadnoughts stood in tight formations, their shields overlapping in a desperate bid to hold the line. It would not be enough. The first engagement was ferocious. Clyson VA's orbital defenses unleashed torrents of plasma and kinetic fire, hammering human ships as they entered the system. Several human cruisers were obliterated in the opening volleys, their hulls shredded by the sheer volume of enemy fire. But humanity did not break. They adapted. While the Council's forces fought with rigid formations, relying on centuries-old tactics of shield walls and defensive posturing, the human fleet moved with a terrifying, fluid precision. Vasquez had given his captains free rein, allowing them to fight like predators rather than soldiers. They darted between the gaps in the enemy lines, exploiting every weakness, every blind spot. Humanity did not fight like a civilization. They fought like an apex predator. The first layer of the enemy fleet collapsed within hours, their formations shattered, their defenses crumbling. But Clyson VA itself still stood. Its planetary shields were among the strongest in the galaxy, capable of withstanding bombardments for weeks, even months. If humanity wanted to end this, they would need to breach the planet's defenses. And for that, they needed something special. On the surface of Clyson VA, Supreme Warlord Virok of the Zarquin Alliance, one of the last remaining high commanders of the Council's forces, watched the battle unfold from within his command bunker. He had never feared anything in his life. Until now. These humans, these primates, had defied every law of war, every expectation, every logical outcome. They fought without fear, without hesitation, without mercy. They did not waver under losses, did not retreat when outnumbered. They simply advanced. Virok turned to his strategists, his mandibles clicking anxiously. How long can our planetary shields hold? One of his advisors, a trembling Valtari officer, hesitated before answering. If their bombardment continues at its current pace, 3 weeks. But, Supreme Warlord, their ground forces are already. A deafening explosion shook the command center. Virok's blood ran cold. The humans had landed. On the outskirts of Clyson VA's capital city, the first wave of human shock troopers emerged from their drop pods, their armored figures wreathed in fire and smoke. The city's defenses roared to life, automated turrets and defensive emplacements unleashing a hellstorm of plasma. But the humans did not slow. They charged. Leading the assault was Colonel Damian Graves, a veteran of Earth's blood war, a soldier whose name was already whispered in fear among the remaining Council forces. His armor was scarred from a dozen campaigns, his rifle steady in his grip. He did not hesitate. "Forward!" he roared, his voice carried over the comms to every soldier in his unit. No survivors. No mercy. The humans fought like demons. The Council's forces, once the overlords of the galaxy, found themselves overwhelmed, outmaneuvered, outmatched in every way. The humans did not fight for conquest, did not fight for territory. They fought for vengeance. They fought for Elias Kane. They fought to ensure that no species, no empire, would ever dare cross humanity again. The battle for Clyson VA raged for hours, then days. Entire districts were reduced to rubble, the air thick with smoke and the screams of dying aliens. The Council's forces fought with the desperation of the damned, knowing that if they fell here, there would be nothing left. And they were right. Humanity pressed forward, city by city, street by street, building by building. Until finally, they reached the Council's last command center. Virok stood within the ruins of his bunker, surrounded by the shattered remains of his command. His personal guards were dead. His officers lay in pieces. The only sound was the distant roar of human artillery, the crackling of flames, and the heavy footsteps of approaching soldiers. The doors burst open. Colonel Graves stepped inside, his rifle raised. Behind him, a squad of human soldiers followed, their weapons trained on Virok. The Supreme Warlord, once a god of war among his people, dropped to his knees. His mandibles trembled. "I surrender," he whispered. "Please." Graves stared at him, his face unreadable behind his helmet. Then he raised his weapon. "There are no surrenders," he said. "Not anymore." The gunshot echoed through the ruined bunker. Virok's lifeless body slumped forward, his blood pooling beneath him. Outside, the sky burned. Humanity had won. And the war was not yet over. The fires of Clyson VA raged for days, its once pristine cities reduced to shattered ruins, its skies darkened with the smoke of burning infrastructure and the rotting stench of the dead. The war was supposed to end here. But it didn't. Because humanity did not simply want victory. They wanted annihilation. Across the conquered worlds of the former Galactic Council, resistance flared in desperation. The shattered remnants of alien fleets struck from hidden strongholds, desperate admirals rallying the last of their forces to launch suicidal counteroffensives. Ground insurgencies erupted in the occupied systems, alien militants conducting ambushes and bombing runs against human occupation forces. Even as the last ruling members of the Council lay dead, their empires broken, their fleets destroyed, their people scattered, still, they fought. Still, they hoped. They had not yet learned. Humanity would teach them. The War Council aboard the Retribution convened in eerie silence. Supreme Admiral Vasquez stood before a holographic display of the galaxy, red blotches marking the final holdouts of resistance. The destruction of Clyson VA had broken the back of the Council's power, but the remnants of their forces still clung to existence in the shadowed corners of space. "We should not waste time with mopping up operations," said High General Alistair Byrne, his voice gravelly and cold. "The survivors are disorganized. Their infrastructure is shattered. We deploy orbital strikes, burn them from a distance. No need for ground engagements." Colonel Damian Graves, still stained with the grime of the Clyson VA slaughter, scoffed. "And what happens when some fanatic in a forgotten system rebuilds in 50 years? When some orphaned admiral unites the survivors into a second council?" He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "We wipe them out. All of them." A murmur passed through the assembled officers. There were no dissenting voices. Vasquez didn't hesitate. "Then we move." The final extermination had begun. The last war. The remaining Council forces knew they were doomed. They had no fleets left to match the human armadas, no standing armies to resist the onslaught. What was once the grandest empire in the galaxy had been reduced to a scattering of desperate warbands, pirate enclaves, and isolated bastions, surviving on sheer stubbornness alone. It was not enough. The extermination of the remaining worlds was methodical, precise. Humanity did not just kill, they erased. Planets that once housed entire species were glassed from orbit, their surfaces turned into molten wastelands. Stations, depots, and hidden strongholds were rooted out, their occupants slaughtered without question. No offers of peace were given, no negotiations entertained. Any race that had stood with the Council, that had raised a hand against humanity, was marked for extinction. On the jungle world of Talsuan, the last fleet of the Valtari species gathered, preparing for a final, desperate stand. Thousands of ships, scavenged from the ruins of their fallen empire, formed a ragtag blockade, hoping to buy time for the evacuation of their people. The human fleet arrived within hours. The battle was short. It was not a conflict between equals, it was a culling. The primitive Valtari defenses were torn apart in precise waves of kinetic bombardments, their ships exploding in rapid succession like firecrackers against the unyielding advance of human warships. The survivors, their vessels crippled and burning, attempted to flee. None escaped. Talsuan burned. The Valtari species, once a proud and dominant force, was erased from existence. And they were not the last. The desperation of the doomed. Across the war-ravaged stars, the remaining species who had once ruled over humanity began to understand what true fear was. Not the fear of battle or loss, but the realization that they were witnessing their own extinction. The Kelsari, a species that had been one of the Council's greatest military powers, attempted to negotiate. Their envoys, trembling and humbled, broadcast desperate messages across the void, pleading for peace. Humanity did not answer. The Kelsari homeworld was encircled by an armada of human dreadnoughts. For days, their planetary defenses held as they begged for surrender, their leaders offering reparations, subjugation, even worship. Vasquez's only reply was a single, brutal order: execute them. From orbit, Earth's battleships unleashed hellfire. The Kelsari oceans evaporated under kinetic bombardment, their cities shattered, their population burned alive in a storm of human wrath. When the fires settled, their world was silent. The Kelsari were no more. One by one, the last of the Council's loyal races fell. The Skari Confederacy, once a sprawling dominion of merchants and slavers, was reduced to drifting rubble. The Zizan, a reptilian race that had openly mocked humanity's weakness in the past, were eradicated in a single night, their planetary core destabilized and shattered. No species that had participated in the execution of Elias Kane was spared. None. The last survivors. When the smoke finally cleared, only one race remained, the Zephyri. Once known as one of the most ancient and advanced civilizations in the galaxy, the Zephyri had initially been among the most vocal in condemning humanity, leading the charge to have Elias Kane executed. Now, They were the lost. The remnants of their people had fled to the deepest corners of the galaxy, their once proud empire reduced to little more than hidden outposts and rogue fleets. But even now, even with their civilization in ruins, they still clung to hope. A HFY fleet, numbering a mere 100 ships, made a final desperate run beyond known space, hoping to vanish into the void, to escape and survive. They never made it. Human stealth cruisers, tracking them from the moment they fled, intercepted their fleet at the edge of the galaxy. The HFY fought, but their resistance was pitiful, their weapons outmatched, their ships crumbling under relentless fire. The last of the HFY screamed over open channels, begging for their lives. Humanity listened. And then they silenced them. The end of the Council. The war was over. The Galactic Council, an empire that had lasted for thousands of years, had been eradicated in less than one. Every species that had participated in humanity's humiliation, every civilization that had dared to raise a hand against them, was gone. Not conquered. Not subjugated. Gone. For the first time in recorded history, the galaxy was silent. And in the heart of this silence stood humanity, victorious, alone. Supreme Admiral Vasquez stood aboard the bridge of the Retribution, gazing out into the void, his hands clasped behind his back. Around him, the officers of Earth's War Council watched in equal silence, as if realizing for the first time what they had done. What they had become. Colonel Graves exhaled slowly. "It's over." "No," Vasquez said. "Not yet." Graves frowned. "There's no one left." Vasquez turned to the holographic display, now empty, devoid of enemy strongholds, of red-marked threats. And yet, deep within the human-controlled territories, there was a new danger. Not from the remnants of the alien species they had slaughtered, but from within. "The Council is gone," Vasquez said. "But we've become something else in the process." A long silence stretched across the room. Because they all knew. There was no enemy left to fight. Now, the only war left was against themselves. The war was over. The Galactic Council was no more. Every species that had dared to challenge humanity had been eradicated. Their fleets reduced to floating wreckage. Their cities turned to ashes. Their history erased. For the first time in the known galaxy, there was only one power. One race that stood unchallenged. Humanity. And yet, the victory did not bring peace. It brought something else. Something darker. Something inevitable. The Empire of Ash. Across the shattered remains of the former Council's domain, human warships now patrolled like silent sentinels. The galaxy, once teeming with diversity and conflict, was now eerily quiet. Too quiet. Vast sections of space had been rendered lifeless, entire planetary systems left barren and smoldering. The extermination had been so absolute that there were regions where no intelligent life remained. Earth's military commanders had planned for the long-term occupation of enemy worlds, expecting resistance, expecting insurgencies. But there was no one left to resist. There were no insurgents. There were no rebels. Only silence. And that silence began to gnaw at the very heart of humanity. The soldiers who had fought the war, who had burned cities, executed planetary populations, glassed entire worlds, began to ask a question none of them had considered before. What happens now? There was no great enemy left. No looming threat. No war to fight. For centuries, humanity had fought to survive, to carve its place among the stars. First against itself, then against alien oppressors. Now, it was alone. And the galaxy it had conquered felt empty. Lifeless. Wrong. The schism. It did not take long for the fractures to appear. Humanity had always been a species of conflict, of competition, of struggle. The war had united them under a single purpose, bound every human world and colony together in a singular, unyielding machine of destruction. But that purpose no longer existed. And so, the unity that had been forged in fire began to splinter. The first signs were subtle. Political disputes within the unified Earth government. Disagreements over what to do with the newly conquered systems. Arguments over whether to repopulate them, whether to claim the abandoned cities, whether to build a new empire on the bones of the old. Then came the ideological battles. Some believed humanity had gone too far, that the war had turned them into monsters, that they had become the very thing they had once despised. Others believed they had not gone far enough, that the extermination of the Council was only the beginning, that humanity was now destined to shape the galaxy in its image. And then, of course, there were those who simply wanted more war, more conquest, more blood. The soldiers, those who had spent years fighting, killing, destroying, were the most restless of all. They had been trained for war, conditioned for it, defined by it. And now, in a galaxy without enemies, they had no purpose, no reason to exist. Some turned to piracy, forming warbands that prowled the lawless sectors of space, raiding abandoned council worlds, hunting the few scattered survivors that had somehow escaped the purge. Others turned on each other. The first civil conflicts erupted within months. Earth's government tried to maintain order, but the cracks in the foundation of their newfound empire were spreading too fast. The colonies, those that had been forced to unify under Earth's rule for the war effort, began to question their loyalty. The Martian Directorate, always resentful of Earth's authority, began withdrawing its fleets from joint operations, claiming they had no interest in policing a dead galaxy. The Outer Colonies, once forced to serve as cannon fodder for the war, started demanding autonomy. And then, inevitably, the first shots were fired. A Martian warship refused an Earth-based inspection order. Earth's fleet opened fire. Mars retaliated. The war had been over for less than a year. And now, a new one had begun. The death of a victory. Supreme Admiral Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Retribution, watching as two human fleets tore each other apart in the orbit of a nameless, dead council world. Human warships, once united against a common enemy, now fired upon each other, their hulls breaking apart in the darkness of space. His officers stood in silence, their expressions grim. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. They all knew what this meant. The war had never ended. It had only changed. Vasquez turned away from the battlefield, his mind drifting back to the day humanity had begun this war. To the moment Elias Kane had been burned alive before the eyes of the galaxy. He had thought, then, that humanity's response would be simple. Justice. Retribution. Vengeance. But now, standing in the wreckage of what was supposed to be their victory, he realized the truth. There was no justice here. No peace. No triumph. Only an endless cycle of destruction. He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes. "Sir," Colonel Graves said, stepping forward. "Orders." Vasquez didn't answer immediately. He stared out at the wreckage, at the dying ships, at the burning debris. Then, finally, he spoke. "Let them kill each other." Graves frowned. "Sir." Vasquez turned, his gaze cold and unreadable. "We started this war to make sure no one ever challenged humanity again," he said. "And we won. But look at us now. We don't need aliens to fight." He gestured toward the battlefield outside. "We'll do it to ourselves." Graves was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "What now?" he asked. Vasquez exhaled. "We go dark." The officers around him exchanged uncertain glances. But they knew what he meant. The Retribution and its fleet, the last remnants of the war's original command, would disappear. They would not take sides in the coming civil war. They would not serve as rulers, nor as enforcers. They would watch. And when the next great war came, as it inevitably would, they would be ready. Because if there was one thing humanity had proven, one undeniable truth that had been carved into the ruins of every alien world they had burned, it was that war never ended. It only waited. The final truth. Across the galaxy, the remnants of humanity's empire crumbled, its factions breaking apart, its leaders struggling for control. On the few surviving alien worlds that had escaped the purge, the last remnants of those species watched in silence, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the day they might rise again. And on Earth, in the ruins of the Galactic Council's once proud homeworld, a single plaque stood amidst the destruction. It bore the last words of Elias Kane, spoken before he was burned alive. You think this will end it? You have no idea what you've just done. And he had been right. The war had never truly been about the Council. It had never truly been about vengeance. It had always been about what humanity was, and what it would always be. A species of war. A species of conquest. A species that, even in victory, would find new wars to fight. Because in the end, that was the only thing they had ever known.